The economic self-harm of Gillard, Swan and Co is breathtaking. And of course, remember, this Climate Change Commission set up by the government was supposed to have been consulting the public about climate change. We haven't heard a peep from it. Perhaps it's got nothing to say, or it's waking up to the fact that the public isn't interested in hearing only one side of the argument. Apparently the Commission says it's about to launch public forums at the end of this month in Canberra and Geelong. Don't hold your breath. Well, Professor Bob Carter is a geologist and environmental scientist and an emeritus fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. He's on the line. Professor Carter, good morning.
Good morning, Alan.
Well, Professor Garnaut was wheeled out last week telling us that there are no major propositions of the mainstream science from 2008 that have been weakened by the observational evidence of these past 2 years.
Well, without wishing to demean Professor Garnaut, who's a distinguished economist, how would he know? And the answer is he knows because as an economist he has to ask somebody else for advice, this being a scientific issue. And the deeply troubling thing for the Australian voter is that Professor Garnaut then asked the United Nations for advice. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, this is the same panel that ex-German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt last week, in a major speech in Germany, accused of fraudulent science advice and demanded an inquiry at the highest level into the quality of the science, or rather the integrity of the science that the IPCC delivers. And yet the sole source of scientific advice that the Australian government is listening to, and Professor Garnaut repeats for them, is the Intergovernmental Panel. And on another issue to do with the Intergovernmental Panel, the Scientific American magazine recently has run a poll. Now, the readers of the Scientific American magazine are all, by definition, interested in the science, and the great majority of them are well qualified and some distinguished qualifications in science. So in response to the question, do you believe that humans are having a major impact on global warming, 80% of the Scientific American readership, and there were 5,000 respondents, 80% said the IPCC is a corrupt scientific organisation that gives political advice. Now, these are stunning figures. I mean, people like Chancellor Schmidt don't make statements like that lightly. The House of Lords in the United Kingdom, about 3 or 4 years ago, with Lord Nigel Northam, was on a committee that looked at the IPCC, and they similarly said the IPCC does not give scientific advice, it gives political advice. So how much longer will the government pursue this course of letting an international agency, unaccountable to Australian voters, not elected by us, set our environmental policy?
But even if carbon dioxide were a pollutant, and I disagree with that proposition, and even if it were doing damage to the atmosphere, why do we go into a so-called carbon-free economy when China, India, Japan and South Korea have no intention of doing it? And as the America's own Environmental Protection Agency has quite clearly said, there is no point in doing all of this. I mean, their exact words, attempting to fight global warming by restricting US greenhouse gas emissions is ineffective and painfully costly. I mean, what the hell are we doing?
Well, it's the political fashion of the chattering classes, and especially of the Greens, who are now part of the government of Australia, remember. But the key issue there, Jon Lomborg, just a couple of days ago, made a new estimate of the costs of what the European Union is doing. And you know, put your seatbelt on, because they are just staggering. In order to achieve a notional, because it's based on a computer model, cooling by the end of this century of 6/100ths of a degree. Now, that's less than you can measure with the thermometers we use to make our meteorological records with. For a putative cooling of 6/100ths of a degree, the European Union is proposing to spend $380 billion a year, every year, which adds up to $34 trillion by the end of the century for a global cooling that you cannot measure. I mean, this is just public insanity.
It is public insanity.
And for the government to be contemplating it even is silly. For them to be pursuing it after the strong reaction they've had from the Australian people, who clearly think this is silly, Well, it's just beyond belief. If Australia stops all its emissions, as you've heard it said, we might cause a cooling of 0.01 of a degree by the end of the century. I mean, these are just incredibly silly numbers. And what's the cost? Because it's the cost-benefit we have to look at. So the claim benefit, if you stop all Australian emissions, is 1/100 of a degree cooling. The cost for a carbon dioxide tax of $25 per tonne is more than $2,500 per Australian family per year. Public insanity is the only word you can use to describe this intended policy.
Well, it's a suicide note for Australia, isn't it? I mean, Julia Gillard says, I want to be very clear with Australians about what pricing carbon does. It has price impacts. It's meant to. That's the whole point. I mean, the whole point is to achieve a meaningful reduction in future warming if it occurs. She can't tell us what that reduction would be.
Well, the greatest competitive advantage the Australian economy has is cheap energy.
Cheap energy,
by coal-fired power
yep.
stations. You levy an unnecessary tax on that. It's economic vandalism. It's going to destroy jobs and it's going to reduce living standards for all Australians.
But why are they allowed to call it a carbon pollution reduction scheme? It's not about carbon, it's carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. I think you said somewhere it's an abuse of logic, language and science.
I was just about to say it again. Thank you, Alan. Because it is. I mean, it's stupefying. Every school child knows the importance of carbon dioxide and so photosynthesis and the fact that plants...
Well, they don't. Every school child is being taught now that carbon dioxide is a pollutant.
In a different part of their course, though, they intellectually compartmentalise it.
Yeah.
So we imagine in biology they're still learning about photosynthesis.
Well, it's the staff of life, carbon dioxide.
Absolutely.
But Julia Gillard said on television last night that I say all these wrong things like there is no such thing as climate change and that CO2 is a good thing. So by inference, she's saying that CO2 is not a good thing.
Well, I know, it's just staggering. And if I could link this to current events,
yeah.
We've all watched with just horror what's been unfolding in Japan. We watched equally with horror what unfolded in Christchurch. We watched with horror what happened when Brisbane got flooded. And we watched with horror the Victorian bushfires of a couple of years ago. Now, all of those events are natural hazards. Did the Japanese say, after the first big earthquake and tsunami, they know there's aftershocks coming, oh, well, we must try and stop the next earthquake. We must stop the next tsunami. I mean, what a stupid question. Have you ever heard a politician say they would stop a volcanic eruption or stop an earthquake? Of course you haven't. Yet we're being told by our government and played for patsies that they can stop climate change. That is just as absurd as trying to stop a volcano erupting, and it should be completely laughed out of court. So the question is, why isn't it laughed out of court? And the answer is this relentless, worldwide, networked propaganda campaign led by the green non-governmental organisations, but now pervasive throughout all our scientific institutions, all of business and all of politics. And the media, most of the media, with the honourable exception of your station and one or two others, are complicit and they are actually cheerleading for them.
One final point, I can answer your question. If we get to the point where we're trading in carbon credits, there are billions of dollars to be made from that process, are there not?
Oh, trillions.
Trillions of dollars.
The second largest trading market in the world,
yep.
is estimated if it came in. Worldwide.
We'll keep at it. It's always good to talk to you. We've got to keep firing.
Okay, Alan.
All right, that's Professor Bob Carter talking a lot of sense and demolishing